Okay, so we're going to get started. In our continued coverage of more advanced topics for this part of the GSS, I'm going to be talking some about the intersection of big data and dynamic modeling. And as a proviso, I would note that the slides for this talk, and indeed my last one, are now on Canvas, if anyone wants to grab them. I would also note that in this case, I'm going to be giving a particularly abbreviated version of a more fulsome talk that I've delivered elsewhere. Actually, I shouldn't say it's just a version of it. It's sort of reworking for this group, etc. But basically, there's a lot more here that I don't have time to go over. And if people wanted to have access to a bigger set of materials here, or for most of my other presentations, I could deliver them. So I entitled this talk, as in some other renditions of related material, Moving Beyond Myth and Madness. And this harks back to a comment by epidemiologist Phil Zuckerman, passed on to me by Mark Orr, who's an agent-based modeler in the health domain, based at University of Virginia. And the comment is that was made by Phil Zuckerman was that models without data are myth, and data without models is madness. And I'm going to be talking today in hopes of giving you just a glimpse of how we can combine new types of data, which I think are quite regrettably and poorly named big data collectively, how we can combine those with dynamic models to speak to the strengths of both techniques and to in fact synergize them. And I don't use that word lightly. We can get something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation and context, skipping over a lot of the normal sort of normal introduction I give to those not familiar with system science. I'll talk about characteristics of big data, because it turns out that this term is being, not surprisingly, overloaded in different contexts in hopes that with people sensing that big data is kind of hot and of interest broadly, a lot of people are trying to render something what they've been working with for a while as big data, and say, well, this is big data too, this is big data. But understandably, there's not a lot of, the term is not a very good one, and there's not a lot of clarity about what that term can justifiably mean. I'll talk about big data and dynamic models, and I'll provide a look at some vignettes, probably just satisfy myself with one, although there are several that I've given in previous renditions of this talk that show how elements of big data can come together with dynamic models. My goal here will be to sort of give you some concrete sense about how they can, give a concrete sense of the sort of data we can be talking about, but I won't be able to go in depth. And so, a lot of what draws us here, I think is the fact that we're confronting as a society and as a world, indeed, ever more complex health policy challenges that I'm not going to comment more on, but where in these contexts, these health contexts, we deal with a situation where we're grappling with systems effects, complexity, where we can be surprised by emergent dynamics that are cannot be merely that transcend and cannot merely be reduced to any one piece of the system or some or average of those pieces. And the patterns seen at within the system require a more holistic, a more sort of broad understanding of where they result from than reducing it in a reductionist fashion to each of the pieces. And very importantly, if we want to make a difference in changing the system and changing the course of health, we need to reason about these emergent effects. Otherwise, we'll be smacked on the face by policy resistance because our our policies will be working against the sort of the nature of things. And I noted earlier in my first introduction that the presence of this complexity, these systems effects, makes it hard to explain what's observed and formulate robust interventions. Now, when we build models in these areas, we're increasingly turning to models that that articulate dynamic hypotheses for the world, and these dynamic models we've been talking about in the course of this week. And a major barrier for building these models, particularly more articulated models that are sought within the policy space, is the fact that reliable evidence concerning health behaviors and indeed exposures of various sorts, exposures to environments, social, physical, pollutants, etc., is actually hard to secure, particularly for the subpopulations we're interested in, particular contexts we're interested in. If you go look at the literature on health behaviors, I think in the NHANES 3 study, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, people were really awoken to the big gap between self-reported physical activity on the one hand and what actual physical measurements through accelerometers actually picked up. When it comes to diet, we know that people have a hard time accurately characterizing their diet. And there may, in both cases, and in the case of weight, where also big gaps are known. There's a wonderful StatsCan sort of study of this that I could refer people to. Some of that may be confabulation. Some of it is due to recall bias and difficulty summarizing things over large periods of time. But people find it difficult to communicate accurately certain types of day-to-day health behaviors that are of great interest to us in understanding the health space and informing our models and grounding our models in empirical data. Our own work has suggested real gaps between what people say as where they spend their time physically and where they actually do, as measured, again, by physical measures with GPS. Some studies in our campus population, for example, have suggested that students tend, for several studies, the SHED studies, of which there have been 8 at this point, suggested that students often report they spend their time in 3 primary areas. 1, the library. They study hard and are good students. Number 2, the physical activity complex. They work out. Number 3, they spend their time doing what they have to do, eating, and spend time with friends in areas where they can eat around campus. If you actually look where they spend their time, I think there's one of those that's true, which is where they spend their time eating. The other 2 are not so indicative of actually where they spend their time. There's big gaps. Similarly, social context. We ran a number of studies, back in 2009, during the flu pandemic, we ran studies with sensors to collect people's contact patterns, and we found huge disparities between who they said they spent time with and who they actually did. Self-reporting was both extremely burdensome and completely misleading as far as where they were saying that they were, or who they were spending time with. And when it comes to aspects of health communication and acquisition of health information online, where they're gathering anti-vax sentiment, for example, there's a lot of interest that people find it. It's often difficult to elicit through self-report. And decision-making rules, heuristics of great interest to Elizabeth, to myself, and indeed to Kurt. I can vouch. And exposure to environments. I'm very interested in exposure to asthmanogenic environments associated with, say, poor air quality, to environments that might expose individuals to pathogens on surfaces, MRSA, the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and trying to figure out where people are picking these things up from is great interest, but also environments at a communication level. Exposure here in the States, they still have billboards for tobacco, right? That can advertise tobacco, or signs in gas stations advertising tobacco. What are people exposed to in an informational environment, in the psychosphere as it is, in addition to the atmosphere? We also are confronting, a variety of challenges that make traditional means of collecting information, like random digit dialing, increasingly difficult. A very large fraction of American households no longer have landlines that you can call, particularly for younger individuals. And a lot of individuals in populations that are underserved are undersampled because of the difficulty of reading them. A key interest for me in the health sphere, since I do so much work with policy partners, is in understanding the pathways that mediate intervention effects from an intervention. Let's say the Moving to Opportunity program here in the States, housing voucher programs which give housing vouchers, and you have families moving to new environments, and if you try to understand the outcomes, which have been mixed for teenage women, for example, lowered obesity levels, lowered levels of pro-criminal involvement, higher high school graduation rates. And if you try to put those in context and try to understand them also in the context of rates for men, which actually suggest no gains in obesity, not statistically significant, and actually worse situation in terms of pro-criminal involvement, there's a lot of puzzles about what might be going on. And hypotheses have been advanced to explain these. For example, with obesity, some have argued perhaps it's reflective of the fact that the girls in the new neighborhood have a greater access to recreational spaces, ball courts, and other community resources, amenities, which draw them out and allow them to engage in moderate, vigorous physical activity. Others have said, well, a lot of it's from walkability. You actually have not crumbling sidewalks or absence thereof, but decent sidewalks, or maybe it's safety. Others have posited, drawing people out, allowing them to move about with greater feeling of personal security may allow for higher levels of moderate, vigorous physical activity. Maybe that's the causal pathway that leads to lower obesity levels. Others have pointed to healthy food availability, the fact that you're moving out of a food desert to an environment that has good grocery stores that are more readily accessible, not as distant, and maybe a lot of the gains are through a causal pathway through healthiness of diet. Yet others have pointed to the fact that these teenage girls are spending more time eating at home instead of eating with friends, and maybe that simultaneously suggests reasons for greater school performance and the fact they're eating mom's home cooking rather than fast food, and that may lead to better dietary outcomes as well. In short, many causal hypotheses have been advanced along causal pathways, but you'll notice a lot of these are hard to gain access to using traditional measures. How much time they're spending actually going to a certain grocery store, the degree to which they're engaging in walkability on the sidewalks, or making use of the ball courts, et cetera, is an important question. If we want to build a dynamic model to accompany, to study a situation like this for a policy context, we might aspire to capture several causal pathways in it, but without some empirical evidence to ground our representation of the degree to which these causal pathways are triggered by a change in intervention, we're going to have a hard time giving quantitative findings from that model that really hold water, that we can be very confident about. So my thesis here, which I'm not going to attempt to prove, but I'll attempt to lend some plausibility to it, is that the advent of big data in health synergizes with and fundamentally enable dynamic modeling in the health space. Because there's a good chance that I'll need to cut this short, I want to cut to the chase with a couple aspects, and I'll try to then provide some vignettes and particulars that might fill in the gaps. basically the sort of data that we're picking up includes sensor data, physically measured things, but also rich self-reports from what are called EMAs, ecological momentary assessments, these sort of micro questionnaires that can be popped to people and where we elicit very high rates of response in many contexts. In the low side, it can be as low as 30%, but for some studies, we have average rates of answering them 2 or 3 questions each, 80% plus, multiple times a day on smartphones. Sensor data from wearables or smartphones. How do these two play together with dynamic models? I'll come to it. I'll give some examples, but let me just give you a sense. So sensor data can help us ground these models in the sense of helping to inform them, and particularly we're taking advantage of the fact that the observations are what I call high velocity, meaning they're high temporal resolution. Particularly when we're dealing with sensor data, we're talking about often many measurements an hour, sometimes many measurements every 10 minutes of things like location, of things like social proximity, of things like people's physical activity level or sedentary behavior. And even if you put multiple sensors together, especially you can get some clues as to the type of posture that they're in, etc. We have work to do, particularly in the activity recognition space, which remains troublingly sort of poor, but we're gaining some high-resolution understanding about what's going on people's social, physical, and physical activity context. These type of data can provide important databases for several things. One is for theorizing about mechanisms in the model that may be applying. One is for model parameterization, to allow us to estimate parameters, say frequency of contact in different contexts, that allows us to put an estimate into the model, say those agent-based models that we had talked about, or frequency of network change. We do this a lot with our models, our agent-based models. They're informed by empirical data that can be gathered through these sort of purposes. And we can have very, very empirically grounded models due to network change or network structure. Calibration, we can match the model outputs up with patterns we see in the collected data in a way that helps us ensure that some uncertainties in the model at least give plausible matches in terms of model output to what we see empirically. And very importantly, the sensor data can stimulate dynamic hypotheses. Critically, and again, this will be a big point, the sensor data, like the models, this is one of the more important points, and it's one that escaped me for a couple years in working with it. The sensor data that we pick up in these studies, and combined with the microdata from questionnaires, often can pick up aspects that relate to different causal pathways that are affected by a given intervention, or that are hypothesized to be affected by a given intervention. So we take something like a move to a mixed income neighborhood, or you take something like a flu sequestration study, which we were involved in as an RCT using these sort of types of data collection. You can actually pick out, using the data, which pathways have been nudged by the intervention, which pathways have changed. Imagine a situation where you have a case crossover study. You collect data about a person before, you put in place the intervention. You can see which pathways have actually been affected by that intervention and which have not, across multiple pathways. Healthy food availability, you look at where people are spending their time, how often they're going to the supermarket. Combine it with some aspects of big data like point of sale data, you can get even more specificity, but you can look at from GPS and from Wi-Fi, how often are they going there. You can look at how much time they're spending at home, their levels of sedentary behavior from wearables or from smartphones. You can ask them about their perception of safety. You can ask them, you can look at how much they're actually using the resources in their neighborhood, never mind that they're available, but are they in fact actionably using them? You can look at their degree of wandering over the neighborhood in terms of navigating the space. And for young men, for whom it's hypothesized with moving to opportunity that what was going on was that they were traveling to their old neighborhood, the old hood, and spending time there outside of parental supervision. You can actually have GPS records that will give you an indication, are they in fact doing it? How much time are they spending there? In short, these sort of types of big data, which we'll be talking about in a minute, can give us a more fine-grained picture of across multiple causal pathways of what's going on. And ladies and gentlemen, that's much what we do with policy-oriented models. We depict multiple pathways. So these types of data that we can pick up can help ground the models in its depiction across multiple pathways, cross-check model predictions of the effect of an intervention, help improve the model, and help, most critically, improve an understanding about why we see certain intervention effects so that we can improve the intervention. An intervention that leads obesity levels almost unchanged is still an enormous opportunity for learning if we can know why, which path. Maybe we increase moderate to vigorous physical activity, but also increase sedentary behavior, and they canceled out. That's a huge gain in knowledge that can allow us to formulate a better intervention subsequently. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
With regards to doing modeling with this ultimate purpose of informing policy
Yep.
or evaluating policy,
Mm-hmm.
do you start already with including these potential intervention points? Let's say you're going through sort
Yep.
of causal loop diagramming
Yep.
first.
Yep.
You already put in there what you perceive to be potential intervention points.
That's
Isn't
common.
it not
Yeah.
possible that, I don't know if you do participatory
Yep.
modeling, but maybe you find out there are other?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And in fact, typically, so when I say a model, a policy-oriented model will include these. As we'll hear a little bit later, you wouldn't want to start with a model that immediately built with all these in there.
Okay.
You'd want to start building it up step by step. You start with the very simplest representation with maybe one causal pathway of interest. And you're learning from that model along the way, and you're bringing it to stakeholders, and you're brainstorming of possible interventions. You're adding pieces in a way that allows you to learn from each piece you've added, know what dynamics it brings to bear. You learn something from the model. You spot problems as you're incorporating with the model. And often that stimulates discussion about interventions as well. And often the participatory processes stimulate ideas about interventions. So,
Nate,
yeah.
I just want to clarify
Yeah.
something, because a lot of people here in our group have interventions that they either have been done or they intend to do, and they've been trying to figure out how to incorporate that into their modeling. And I just want to clarify that my sense is that it's more fruitful to get the model to zero in on representation of the process that you care about, and then think about how the intervention fits in, and not bring the intervention in as part of the model from the get-go.
Yeah, so I'd like to comment on that. So I agree with that completely. But one of the key factors that shapes model scope, if you definitely know, and our stakeholders say, okay, we'd like to be able to examine these interventions. One of the things that affects model scope is we need a way of capturing the effects of those interventions. If we're going to evaluate their outcome, we need a representation of the processes that is at a level.
To zero in on what processes might be.
Exactly. Like, do we need to have this process in place? Do we need to actually keep track of this aspect of a person's history or their network context? If you have an intervention which will treat a person differently based on their history, like we'll treat frequent flyers in our STI clinics. I guess we're not supposed to call them frequent flyers now. In our health system, they're supposed to be called friendly faces. Friendly faces in our STI clinics. Differently than others. If that's an intervention that they want to investigate, we need a model which in its scope actually can support that, which actually would mean an individual-based model so we can keep track of the number of times they've been there, not just a compartmental system dynamics model. If we want to have an intervention that's focused on networks and changing network structure, or intervening based on someone's position in a network, intervening on people who are hubs in a network as peer educators, we probably want a model that represents networks. And so it helps us think this through. In our causal loop diagrams, what we'll often do is say, this is where such and such intervention might intervene. But the causal diagram is diagramming the underlying processes, the hypothesized
That's what I
underlying
wanted to
processes.
clarify,
Yeah. Great. I appreciate that. So a key value add that we're seeking here is deepening learning from interventions by allowing us to delineate pathways. And this is something that both dynamic modeling on the one hand and the sort of big data allow us to do, is to delineate particular pathways to effect. And it allows us to keep our model more honest because we can delineate effects across multiple pathways and cross-check them with the model and improve the model, learn from that extra data, and we can further use ways to improve the intervention even more effectively. So that's some of where we're going here, but I'd like to give you a concrete sense. So when I say big data, what am I talking about? For years, gosh, a decade, more than a decade, I've been working with, some data that by standards of the States would be considered large-scale administrative data, population-wide administrative data from Canada, billing data, et cetera. Of the sort I think you can get in the States for Medicare population, et cetera. But this is population-wide, essentially, because we're a single-payer healthcare system. Would I consider that big data? Yeah, I would sort of put it on the borderline. But when I'm talking about big data, I'm particularly talking about data that is characterized by what's called the 4 V's. This is a framework that I think was originally with Google, and I think it's actually the least bad framework I've heard. I actually really dislike the term big data. I think it focuses things as it's commonly defined by technologists. It is not very useful in its sort of definition. But I think of this as basically the least bad operational definition I can get. It's data characterized by 4 characteristics that happen to begin with V. Volume. It has large amounts of volume. That's what we talk about. When we say big, people think, lots of it, right? I could fill up this room. No, it's big. There's tons of evidence, okay? And that's good. Lots of data points for analysis with machine learning or statistical tools. For certain types of, you have quite a bit of power for certain types of calculation. But what I think is more important, particularly in a dynamic modeling context, and in fact for health, is velocity. When I talk about velocity, what I'm talking about is its high temporal resolution. 8,000 tweets a second out there, folks. Over 10,000 at sort of bursty periods. The accelerometer data that's being collected on this phone is giving me thousands of data points every 5 minutes. My GPS is being measured about every 5 to 10 minutes. Even small EMAs, these ecological momentary assessments, multiple times a day. Compared to once a quarter getting a phone call from a study organizer asking about your attitudes, it's high velocity even there. But maybe even more importantly, arguably even more importantly, it's high variety, meaning that simultaneously on this given respondent, this given person, we have data from multiple things. We have data about where they are. We have data about their levels of physical activity or sedentary behavior. Something about their posture potentially from combinations of the various sensors. Something about who they're with from Bluetooth or by cross-linking their data with others. Something about their attitudes, beliefs, and concerns or intentions from ecological momentary assessments. And all these can be cross-linked from that same person. So we know something about where they're exercising. We know with whom they're exercising. We know how that changes over built environments or changes over context. So variety is really important. It's not that those are each solitudes, but they, in fact, the cross-linking is what makes them particularly valuable. Finally, there's this notion of veracity, which I think is a poor term, but the point is that we have physical measures of some things which are known to be very problematic for self-reported, not to mention very burdensome. Where people are, who they're with, how much physical activity they're getting. We can get physical measures of what they're eating by just having them snap a photo of it, which we do. And we've gotten great great participation rates in many studies. And we actually have a photo of that which a dietitian can look at, for example. So certain measures are less subject to self-report. And it turns out if you put multiple sensors together, you can get, and multiple measurands together more generally, you can actually get, you can kind of triangulate and get much greater confidence about certain things. So when I say big data, I'm thinking about sensor data from, think about Fitbit, think about, Jawbone, think about these Mio, these wristbands and so on. But also think about the fact that your smartphone is chock-a-block full of sensors. And it keeps them for very prosaic reasons. So when you rotate the screen, it can adjust the image. It has a 3-axis accelerometer of comparable quality to what you get on these wristbands. But that's not all. Search volumes, Twitter, social media data, data from environmental sensors around us. Our buildings increasingly are robots. They actually measure the airflow, measure the air temperature, the humidity, measure aspects of our environment on a very continuous basis. Lab test results, point of sale data from purchases, questionnaire responses on these small on-device questionnaires, voice, audio. For some of our studies with schizophrenics, we're recording audio at sampled times during the day, for example. Communicational data, browsing behavior. For one study with Harvard, we're capturing not just URLs that they go to, but contents of web pages that mention tobacco-related products, for example, etc. So when we're dealing with this sort of data, we're dealing with a spectrum of sort of types of volume of data collection and velocity, etc. On the far side are sort of search monitoring and so on, which are coarser insights, lower recruitment challenges, they're less flexible. Many of them are already in the public domain, like Twitter, Twitter data and search data. On the flip side, we can go to mobile data collection from wearables and smartphones, which give finer insights. They have higher recruitment challenges, so by no means, we've run dozens and dozens of these studies, and they're more flexible. So let's just give a very brief sense. So search behavior, worldwide there's something like 60,000 searches a second that are performed. I looked for Australia, I presented this, some of these slides in Australia, about 500 searches a second there. The US would be many, many times that, because its population is over 10 times that. And volumes of search data can provide some insights. This is from pertussis in Australia, where I was just looking around. We do work on pertussis. We monitor data related to pertussis on Twitter, and we'll sometimes tap search data for many communicable illnesses. And this shows sort of ongoing searches for whooping cough over time in Australia. And then you see this giant spike in this elevated rate. This is over a year later. This is the death of baby Riley from pertussis, a tragic case of a baby that died due to pertussis and incomplete vaccination in his family. And it really galvanized public consciousness, and you can see some evidence of, let's just put it this way, of heightened awareness following that, and heightened awareness in the short period after it. Social media data, well, there's all sorts of platforms out there, and many of them have the ability to gather data from them. So we have very active programs with Twitter. WhatsApp also has an API, Tumblr as well for sort of microblogging, an API to which we have access. And social media monitoring provides glimpse of sort of diversity of expressed attitudes and beliefs across large groups of the population. Is it representative of the population? No. People who have loud voices on Twitter are hardly a sample representative of the whole population. But it does give you some sense of kind of discourse related to issues, and particularly influential discourse on certain topics. This is key interest. Unfortunately, social media has played a very large role, it appears, in strengthening anti-vaccine sentiment, for example. And people who are vocal on Twitter have a disproportionate following there. There are pronounced differences between the platforms in terms of what's included, et cetera. Something like Facebook has a lot of health-related information, but it's private, and you need to go and consent to each person in it. Twitter is a public forum for expression. People self-publish on Twitter. Anyone can go and sign up for someone until Donald Trump bans you, and you can get onto people's Twitter feeds, and as such, ethics boards are often much more comfortable with this. Whereas Facebook, you need to go through rigorous ethics with the person to allow access to the types of information there. Social media provided a glimpse of diversity, attitudes, beliefs across the population, and it's hugely voluminous. Somewhere over 300 million users worldwide. In the US, probably closer to 70 million now. And, bursty times is more than 10,000 tweets per second out there. The interesting thing is a lot of these tweets, not all, but a fair number can be geotagged, and you can infer where they're coming from, either directly or indirectly, a vastly large group. And you can filter by content, time, geography, very poorly by sentiment. And you can get some insights from things like retweeting, et cetera, behavior. So this sort of data, why is it of interest? In search data? Well, what we found is, it's interesting. In health, all of you folks are, I'm sure, familiar with the hierarchy of evidence that's sometimes talked about, with randomized controlled trials, RCTs lying at the pinnacle traditionally, and these successively lesser, drosser forms of evidence sort of coming down the hierarchy. From a system science perspective, you've got to be a little bit cautious about that. I'm a big believer in evidence-based and evidence-informed policymaking. But one has to be cautious about RCTs, for example, being held up as the pinnacle of excellence in terms of health insight, because they control for some of the most important things that shape real-world outcomes, right? They control for aspects of compliance or people talking with each other, et cetera, things that make a huge difference whether a drug actually succeeds in conferring health benefits are controlled for very carefully by RCTs, and there's not an examination of some of the key factors. But suffice it to say that when we've taken data from very different levels of this hierarchy and combined it, so we get clinical reports which are validated, say, with lab tests for infectious disease, and we combine it with data from social media or searching in our models, we can actually get much better results from combined than either in isolation. You would never want to just depend on this data for an indication, say, how many people are in a state of fear with respect to a infection. But if you combine it with clinical self-report or clinical reports from the hospitals, you can get something that is better than you'd get for those clinical reports alone. And this was one of the lessons of the bioinformatics revolution in machine learning, is that you can't say that, okay, this is a low-quality line of evidence, we won't use it in preference only for high-quality ones, without sacrificing some important insights. And with the right approaches analytically, you get benefits by combining both, and particularly high-volume data. So the sorts of data that we get over time from these sorts of reports can give us a lot of insight, even though it's noisy, even though it's imprecise. It is longitudinal, and it can be a good match to serve as an input to a model, or to ground a model, or to help us compare sort of model findings against the data that we might see coming in from social media or from searching.
Can I just
Yeah.
say more thing about that?
Sure.
I think there is a lot of promise in these sort of activity data. I think there's some great books coming out now, and we're happy to give references. And one of them is Matt Saldonick's Byte by Byte, and one of the is a nice layout of some of the challenges of working with these data, and I think one thing that we're not normally attuned to, because it's so different from what we normally do, is that these data are coming from places that were not collected to do the research that we plan to do. Normally, we go out and collect the data, we have questions in mind, but these are kind of found data. And that has a lot of implications in terms of the environment in which people interact on Twitter is a very specific environment that may promote or negate certain kinds of behavior. And then another thing is oftentimes on all of these websites, they're changing the design constantly. And so one of the cautions with longitudinal data coming from these is that there may have been tweaks to the infrastructure of the site, like Google or Twitter, that we don't see but may have affected interactions. And it's just something you have to live with, but it's something you need to be tuned into.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And certainly this data is observational in character and ecological, and suffers from the qualifications due to that. On the other hand, there are system science analytic approaches that can help us take advantage of that data and still extract, in fact, indications of causal strength out of factors like that. We're working with convergent cross-mapping is a very exciting approach there. I want to talk a little bit about the smartphone context, because I think this is going to be particularly large, and because it's one we have a lot of experience on. With. We've been running a project, it's called the IEPI project, and it dates back to 2009, 2010, which we've been running. It's available on these days in what's called the Ethica data platform. That was a spin-off from our lab. It has a representation on Android and iOS. And basically, it's a system that is focused on epidemiological data collection that allows you to create new studies that have custom interfaces or interfaces that are customized around some constraints, and can collect rich, graphically defined survey data as well as sensor data. And not surprisingly, you can collect some of these types of data that are the biggest stumbling blocks with traditional data sources: location, physical activity, spatial proximity of individuals and social context, and communicational data. So we can map out, where people are engaged in physical activity, where social interactions take place over time, and we can look at, via these micro surveys on the devices asked of people. We can look at where people are smoking, or when people are smoking and vaping over time for a given individual. This shows an individual engaging in vaping behavior and engaging in bouts of smoking simultaneously, not vaping to quit smoking, not vaping as a gateway purely to smoking, but dual use. We can map out where those occur. Where are they smoking? Where are they vaping over time? To what degree is it based on workplace restrictions, for example? To what degree is it occurring in the home or in a vehicle? And we can also look at, where, this is for foodborne illness, where are people eating? Where are they eating non-home cooked foods within our study and related to reports of illness? So the goal of this system, basically, which it's largely succeeded, is to be able to create very quickly new studies that will collect this sort of data, go through the appropriate ethics channels, but do so without a programmer being required. So you can quickly deploy something, try it out with a pilot group, refine it, and then get it out to a much larger group who are sometimes go through video consent and don't even have to be physically present. A foremost goal of this system, which needs to be taken into account for any smartphone-based work, is security and confidentiality. And for us, this meant from the very get-go the ability to snooze data collection on the device at any point, so people can opt out of data collection, to retroactively go back and delete their data. That's provided for most studies, so that they can go back and say, I really don't want that data from yesterday to be included at all. Strong on-device encryption, to the point if I found, even though I'm co-creator of this project, if I found a device I couldn't make sense of it, because it has double layers of encryption and secure transmission and censoring of certain types of information. Of central interest is the informed consent process, which we've gone through dozens of times with these, and often that's done in a tiered way, so that someone provides consent for using the data in certain ways. So, for example, they're only comfortable being analyzed in an aggregate way, or comfortable it only being published in an aggregate way, as opposed to having anonymized, de-identified photos of their activity levels over time being used for publication or what have you. So, big health data and dynamic modeling. How do these come together? Well, big health data provides fundamentally key empirical evidence to inform policymaking by informing dynamic models. It can help us, I argue, together with dynamic models, learn from intervention effects, where that learning is sharpened by the fact that we know what we're expecting from a dynamic model across these causal pathways, and we can compare it to what we get from the big data, say from a phone or from evidence from social media. We can take the data from the system and use it to keep what I call keep a model honest, to recurrently reground this model in what's going on, so that it's always got the latest evidence to look forward. And this is of great interest to our policy partners. They're very interested in this in dealing with outbreaks, for example, where a model, because of the vagaries of stochastics, even the very best model, the most model with all the right estimates and an excellent depiction of the system in it, it's not going to be able to predict which way certain stochastics will go. And you want a system that can keep that model in line with the latest evidence, so that it's always got the latest understanding of what's going on in the system, and then can be used to look forward and anticipate what might be coming down the line, or the trade-off between interventions like outbreak triggered intervention, immunization campaign. And it can help inspire interventions to be investigated. Just to give a concrete vignette of here, we've done some work with foodborne illness. This is with my colleague Cheryl Waldner, who's an expert on safety in the food system. He's been working in that area for dozens of years now. And we were confronting a situation where the knowledge about foodborne illness is extremely impoverished. The fact is that only a very small fraction of people who get foodborne illnesses actually report it. And we're dealing with a situation where the reported cases are, to put it in Cheryl's terms, I asked her, so we're dealing with something like the tip of the iceberg in terms of reported cases compared to all cases. She said, not even close. It's like the spike of ice on the tip of the iceberg. We're dealing with less than 1%. We're doing 0.5% is an estimate of how much fraction of cases that are actually reported for foodborne illness. And as a result, our ability to understand the dynamics is limited, but maybe more to the point, more significant for public health, our ability to quickly squash outbreaks is really impaired. Because there can be a lot of people who get sick, never go to the doctor before just those couple people get sick enough, they go to the hospital, they're confirmed to be with foodborne related pathogens, and an outbreak is triggered. An outbreak investigation is triggered. So there's some big uncertainties within our space reflecting the paucity of evidence. Factors related to risk perception and risk awareness, and how it's affected by outbreak investigations that are announced, or the degree to which people seek food at vendors and how that changes over time. The accuracy, this is a key one, accuracy of recall, how well people can actually recall, and the number of subclinical illnesses. So, we have built a study which basically uses our standard system, created a little interface. Each of these buttons basically could ask some questions. These can all be defined without programming. You basically just drag in the elements, kind of like putting together SurveyMonkey or Google Docs or Google Surveys. You just drag these things in and sort of say what choices you want and so on, and you can push them out to people during a pilot if you want to correct typos or change the face. So you have these couple buttons, and basically people could indicate things. And For example, they could report when they're sick, and then we could ask them questions about, for example, did you see a healthcare professional? What were the nature of the symptoms? The point is, people were doing this for many, many more cases than they were, in fact, seeking care for. So we were getting a vastly larger collection of knowledge of illness, subclinical illness being particularly represented. At the same time, they would take photos of food that they ate. And this food, they'd answer some questions about these things. So what were they eating? Where did they purchase it? And so on. And some used audio to provide an explanation of what they ate. Others typed in text. Others wouldn't give a response at all. And we had thousands of these things reported. So it was a 3-month study, about 90 or so people in it. And people reported around, I think, 1 to 2 meals a day with this, taking photos, providing explanation, etc. This is the website for the system, which you can look. These are different studies, and I'm looking at this particular study and looking at the data from it. And we get individual trajectories out. Now, this is getting closer to the modeling, because modeling gives you individual trajectories for agents in the model, right? Over time, an agent evolves. And we have similar data from these systems, right? So we have data when they ate food at home. We have data from when they ate food outside of home, and the nature of that food. We have photos and some statement. And we have indications, these are the red, of when they reported illness. And in fact, the symptoms of the illness accompanying it, etc. Only a very small fraction of these actually brought them to the doctor. And that's exactly the point. We want to at least get to the tip of the iceberg. And hopefully we can get a large part of the subsurface beyond the iceberg. So we can know something about to what degree are they actually eating meals from vendors, which vendors are they eating from, right? We can, and I'll show, we can know where they're eating just before illness. This is all temporally linked, right? We can look, okay, 24 hours before plausible foodborne illness, where did they eat food, right? If you look at the fraction of questionnaires, this is a histogram. The x-axis is the fraction of questionnaires that they answered. The y-axis is the fraction of participants who had that level of adherence or compliance or whatever you want to see. And what you can see is the single most common category in terms of a level of answering was somewhere around 90 to 95% of the questions they answered, which is not bad compliance, not bad involvement rate. You had some down at 60%. They were getting multiple questions a day. So not too bad in terms of response. A lot of it has to do with the psychology. If you see a short question, 2 questions, 3, you just do it and you get rid of it. It's quicker than getting rid of it in another way often. So data like this can start to fill in gaps. It can start to allow us to say, okay, take data we have from traditional sources and combine it with data that we can ask people about risk perception. We can see where they're going for food. We can test the accuracy of the recall. And indeed, we had many instruments. I didn't show them, but just to give a sense here, we had many instruments to cross-check their answers, but also many instruments to ask them, what did you eat last week? Can you describe it on a certain day? Because those are the types of questions that are asked during an outbreak investigation traditionally. We could particularly get an understanding of subclinical illness. So what does all this have to do with modeling? Oh man, oh gosh, I guess those slides are not properly enabled. Pardon me for just a second. We can do things like use these to indicate, okay, how long do people report symptomology, for example, after recovering? So here, someone's either in a healthy state, this is what I call a state chart, and any logic, someone's in a healthy state, or they've been exposed to illness, and that could either be clinical or subclinical in nature, and after a certain amount of time, they return to a healthy state in terms of behavior. And we can estimate that from the data. We can also take a look at what fraction actually go in for clinical care or not. Is there published data on that? There's guesstimates, but they're not for our jurisdiction. They're not, in light of the city that we're in and the availability of care facilities, walk-in clinics, etc. So we can do some pretty good, give some pretty good estimates to where these data, to how these data inform the model. And there's several other places they can inform the model as well, including ability for a person to recall from last week, which is what we normally hinge on. So in short, we can take data collected by a system like this. Some of that data goes into parameter estimates. Some of that data is matched against model predictions in terms of how often illness should occur, for example, and you can use it to calibrate an aspect of the model for parameters that are less well known. So there, with calibration, you're taking model output and you're comparing it against empirical data you have over time, data that can't be reduced to one parameter alone, but as a result of an emergent process. And then you're adjusting parameters that are less well known to best match that data. Does it give you a model that's guaranteed to be correct? No. It gives you a model that has a certain face consistency with the data, but it's one you have to be cautious about, taking it as the truth. But calibration is a very common process among many modeling processes, many modeling projects, and the types of data we can get from these systems allow us to make use of the types of data we collect for calibration as well. Just seeking to finish this up after not too long, I will note that another way we've used this sort of data is to evaluate the effects of interventions. Here we actually asked about an intervention. If we used the type of data we could get on a smartphone about subclinical illness, how much could it reduce the burdens associated with foodborne illness compared to a baseline case where we rely on traditional clinical reporting? And what it suggested is just a small fraction of the population, a sentinel group of 4% of people reporting this sort of data on themselves, could yield a vastly faster ability to diagnose incipient foodborne illness outbreaks, and therefore a much lower burden of spread of foodborne illness before that restaurant gets located and shut down. I've commented there, just working to finish up here. We've run dozens of studies with this system. Not all the studies using smartphone data do so for modeling, but it's an important guide for it. I do want to highlight one very exciting element of this, which is using the sort of data we get from these feeds to keep these models grounded in the latest estimates. I mentioned it before. The technique of art here is known as sequential Monte Carlo, or the particular method of what's called particle filtering. Okay? And there's a very straightforward process to perform particle filtering with system dynamics models, aggregate system dynamics models. It's a very powerful, straightforward tool to use, and we have a little toolbox that we've used for somewhere over half a dozen studies now. And this directly addresses some needs by our policy partners, because they're interested in knowing, particularly for cases where there's waning vaccination, what's the likelihood we'll see an outbreak in the next little bit, and what's the likelihood that a few incipient cases will give rise to an outbreak? How concerned should we be? And if an outbreak is in progress, how soon is it likely to fizzle out, or how long is it likely to go? And fundamentally, I don't have time to go into this in detail. There's a rich mathematical framework drawn from machine learning that grounds this, okay? But fundamentally, it's almost like you're running a model over a distribution of possible outcomes. So instead of giving one estimate of output for a system dynamics model, it's giving a distribution. And that distribution is informed by the data received up to this point. So the idea is that the model is told about the data reached up to a certain point, and through a formal process known as particle filtering, which is a Bayesian so-called filtering method, extensively used in machine learning in other spheres. Basically, it incorporates that understanding. It learns, as it were, from that data. In terms of estimating the current state of the system, how many people are in each state, even though they're not directly observed. That's part of the latent state, and it's designed to estimate that sort of latent state. And it can help you figure out values for parameters to a degree as well. And basic idea is, as time continues, you get more and more data. The model updates its estimates for what might be coming up. So you imagine a situation where you go week by week, and as more data comes in, you're more and more confident about what lies before you, what's coming up. And more confident that when you look at the trade-off between interventions, like an outbreak response intervention, which is one of the key instruments our partners are interested in, it'll give you an estimate of, given all that's known till now, given the current situation we're probably in based on all the data till now in terms of how many people are likely to be in this stock or that stock, it gives you a probability distribution over joint probability distribution over people in the state of the system in the stocks. It lets you basically ask, okay, how much would this intervention pay off as a distribution going forward? Very powerful technique, fairly straightforward to apply. Kurt's done some early work applying it to agent-based models, but the challenges are much larger there for a couple reasons. We're working on a system that will allow us to do that, a software system. But and there's no reason in principle it couldn't be applied to agent-based models. The question is, how effectively can it be applied to them? And the jury's still a little bit out on that. But overall, this is a system that uses machine learning in streaming data, including data from behavior online, such as searches, to inform our models on an ongoing basis. It's my own conviction that 10 years from now, certainly 20 years from now, in the policy space, we'll be using models like this a great deal. And the important insight for me is that when we have emerging infectious diseases, or when we have phenomena that are unexpected and new, and we don't have good data to ground a model, we can often build a rough and ready model and just always correct it with new data in a way that will allow it to learn from this. This is one of a family of techniques, particle filtering. There's an even more powerful technique called particle MCMC that we're working with that will take this to another level. But when it comes to big data, when it comes to models that exploit big data, this will be a very significant development over the next decade. I would predict, in terms of practical tools to take a model and combine it with the latest evidence. And the finer grained this data can be, if you have data on a daily level, it is more than 3 times, it can improve the accuracy of the model by more than a factor of 3 compared to data every 3 days. So the temporal specificity, the temporal fine-grained nature of this data is absolutely key. And getting data, therefore, from ongoing streaming sources like even sources like search behavior or Twitter that might clue you in to behavioral patterns related to contacts and mixing, et cetera, and vaccination interest can be of great value for informing the models. Okay. A final set of data I will just note, we've done work with simulation to ask if we have data, we have data from a very fine-grained level, we run it with a simulation model, see the results. Data on, say, contact patterns between people. We take that data, which is recorded every 5 minutes, say, and we downsample it. We knock out data so that it only includes data sampled every 20 minutes or every half hour. For certain domains, we have found that the models, when parameterized with that less frequently measured data, give very different results than with very fine-grained data. This is of concern because it suggests that for certain types of needs, this sort of micro contact data, this micro behavioral data, may not be a luxury. It may not just be something that opens great doors for us. It may be a necessity for giving accuracy at the level that certain policy makers are asking for. So just be aware that there are certain types of processes that it seems that this sort of data we're talking about with big data, from phones, from social media, may actually turn out to be absolutely essential to give very, very strong policy advice within these spheres. Okay. I'm going to finish up now. I'll just say where we're going with this in Canada is model-informed population observatories, large-scale groups of people. We have provincial-level interest in this from a large Western Canadian province that's interested in having large groups of individuals carry systems and record information over time, a sort of rolling cohort. We're very interested in this on a larger scale basis, where the idea would be people opting in, potentially on a compensatory basis, in other cases just as a civic contribution to low burden measurement associated with certain aspects of behavior, where some of the data is held in escrow until it's needed. The idea being a foodborne illness outbreak is possibly occurring, or an outbreak of infectious disease, or something like the opioid epidemic. We want to know something about what's going on recently that's led up to this. We could bring data out of escrow and actually make use of it. There's a lot of technologies that are coming together on the encryption side, on the side of making collection of this sort of data very straightforward and very flexible. And we believe that following larger scale groups with this sort of data in sort of Amazon Mechanical Turk type fashion, where there's hundreds of thousands of people carrying and offering up data, potentially for pay by researchers or government related to health, is a real possibility. So closing remarks. Empirically grounded models require data. Data, particularly models in the policy sphere, require a lot of evidence to ground them to the level needed to give confident policy advice. Electronically captured data is increasingly ubiquitous. It's a reality of the world around us. It is increasingly lending insight into social trends as well as health trends. When it comes to things like vaccine hesitancy, the types of information we can glean from online sources provide an absolutely critical source of information for understanding behavior that otherwise would be operating within blinders. Commodity sensor-bearing devices, such as wearable devices, phones, etc., can serve dual uses as sensor, EMA, and crowdsourcing platforms. We can get people to volunteer information, like when they're taking photos. We can ask them micro questions, and we can use it to record sensor data of diverse sorts. Coupled with models, this sort of data can offer significant complementary health insights, with some of the biggest gains being in understanding the effects of interventions, so we can learn more quickly from them across multiple causal pathways. We can know what they've successfully changed, where they've fallen short, how that differs from what we would have expected via the model, and it helps us learn more from the intervention and helps us improve the model. Cross-linked sensor data and EMA data, as well as other components of big data, offer tremendous potential to complement and sharpen dynamic modeling. If we're interested in understanding people's exposure to tobacco advertising online, in person, and we're interested in how that affects their health behavior, there's really no substitute for the type of data we can get from systems like this. You're not going to be able to ask people on a quarterly basis to recall how often they've come into contact with online advertising or billboards or what have you with confidence. but by getting this fine-grained data, we can ask at times that are proximate, temporally proximate to the exposure, and we can ask them to actually volunteer information about encounters and use that information automatically gathered from online encounters. And machine learning techniques, like particle filtering, that I haven't had time to go into, can really enhance the power of dynamic modeling. For us, as a research group, the ability to combine these machine learning techniques with system dynamics models in a very tractable way is is a very strong reason we make central use of system dynamics models for many projects. And it's one that over time we're making more and more easily undertaken for system dynamics and agent-based modeling. So, a lot of material, different topic in terms of some of the understanding, the big data, and one I haven't had time to go into. But I hope it gives you some glimpse as to a very important shift within the potential for informing dynamic modeling in coming years. The big data revolution, as it's been called, and dynamic modeling are not solitudes. They are not in competition. They are going to increasingly inform one another and increasingly shape one another. I haven't talked about how dynamic modeling can form more savvy collection of data. I only hinted at it. But there's bidirectional needs as well that I didn't have time to go into here. For me, this is one of the more exciting components of looking forward in the next decade or two for dynamic modeling, because I think it will allow us to build models that move out of the realm of speculation and into the realm of grounded evidence on behavior. And for me, that's a strong development because we have problems that urgently need to be solved. So, thank you very much, and glad to answer any questions if there are any. Yes?
What is the best way to accomplish such?
The best way to